The paper I'm presenting today is the third in a series on closed-mindedness. Sarah, Amy, and Alicia have all impacted my thinking about this, so I'm really grateful to the three of them. I'm hoping to write a book on closed-mindedness, and I expect there'll be a chapter on epistemically hostile environments, and that chapter will include some work on fake knowledge and fake news. So this conference has been extremely useful for me. I've learned a lot. Okay, so we're going to start with a paradigm case of closed-mindedness. So I'm just going to run through the handout. Here we go. All right, so many of us know somebody like Paul. Paul believes the people who commit crimes are simply irredeemable. He thinks they're broken human beings who can't be fixed. He's stuck with these beliefs throughout his life and is unwilling to engage seriously with ideas or evidence to the contrary. So he summarily dismisses any competing ideas that cross his path without evaluating their merits. When the conversation turns to educating the incarcerated, Paul deems it ridiculous and shuts down, closing himself off. When he sees an article supporting re-entry programs, he thinks it's silly and scrolls past it. He recognizes that such ideas compete with his own, and he rejects them because they seem implausible. So I think Paul is a paradigm case of closed-mindedness, at least when it comes to this specific issue. He need not be generally closed-minded. Okay, so what is closed-mindedness, and is it always an intellectual vice? So I'm going to adopt a working analysis of closed-mindedness as an unwillingness or inability to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options. There's a lot packed in there. I'll do what I can to sort of bring you up to speed with the account I'm trying to give. So one important thing to know right at the outset is that I'm treating closed-mindedness as something like a personality trait or a character trait that need not, the way I'm trying to define it, it need not be an intellectual vice. It's the sort of quality that could be a vice or could be a virtue. Okay, so I'm not presupposing that it's a vice. So to be, I think Paul has a very recognizable species of closed-mindedness. I think he's dogmatic. He's unwilling to engage seriously with relevant alternatives to a belief he already holds. I'm going to suggest that the disposition of closed-mindedness is an intellectual vice in standard cases like Paul's, but that it's not always an intellectual vice and can even be an intellectual virtue. And I'm going to suggest two ways in which I think it could be an intellectual virtue. I'm going to suggest a case of one-off instances of closed-minded action that can be intellectually virtuous, and then I think that it's also possible for the disposition of closed-mindedness to be an intellectual virtue in epistemically hostile environments. Okay, so just starting with the working analysis of closed-mindedness and dogmatism. So this paradigm case of Paul, he's unwilling to engage seriously with alternatives to a belief that he already holds, right? Once a criminal, always a criminal, or something like this, right? So I think this is dismissing relevant alternatives to a belief you already have is one way to be closed-minded, but it's not the only way. So I'm going to use Paul's case to talk about four features that we see in Paul that aren't necessary for closed-mindedness in general. Okay? So closed-mindedness is broader. Okay? It's an unwillingness or inability to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options. So I think there are four features of Paul's case that are not necessary for closed-mindedness. One of the first feature is already having extant beliefs about a particular topic. The second feature is closed-mindedness does not have to be restricted to the locus of ideas and evidence. The third feature is that closed-mindedness doesn't require engaging with intellectual options. And the fourth feature, the one that the virtue ethicists give me the most trouble about, is closed-mindedness does not require unwillingness. It can also be an inability. Okay, so just running through these features. So 3A, having beliefs about the topic. So we see this in Paul. He already has a belief about the topic. But we can consider cases like Pauline. She has no beliefs about the topic in question, and she's being confronted with evidence about this topic for the very first time. I think she can still arrive at an initial belief by conducting a closed-minded inquiry. She may ignore or be oblivious to evidence that supports the success of reentry programs, for instance. So I think in these cases, this shows that closed-mindedness doesn't require having extant beliefs. I think dogmatism does require having extant beliefs, but closed-mindedness doesn't. Paul is both closed-minded and dogmatic. Pauline, who's confronting the evidence about reentry programs and so forth for the first time and is unwilling to engage with or is oblivious to evidence about the success of reentry programs, say, is closed-minded but not dogmatic. Okay. The locus of ideas and evidence. This is the second feature that we see in Paul's case that I think isn't necessary for closed-mindedness. So Paul's closed-minded with respect to ideas and evidence that compete with the belief he has. Pauline is closed-minded with respect to ideas and evidence in initially coming to arrive at a belief. But I think we can be closed-minded in the way that we conduct inquiries more generally. So we can be closed-minded with respect to which questions we ask, with respect to which sources we consult. This is particularly important online, and which methods we use. So I think what this means is that the locus of closed-mindedness isn't restricted to ideas and evidence. Its locus is going to be broader. And to capture its broadness, I'm just using the general category of intellectual options. I do not have like a necessary and sufficient condition definition for that, but it's going to include, the category of intellectual options is going to include things like ideas and evidence, questions, sources, methods, and so forth. So those are the kinds of things that get in that category. Okay, third thing that we see in Paul's case that isn't required for closed-mindedness is engaging with intellectual options. So technically Paul engages because he dismisses, okay? So and in dismissing, what he's doing is something like recognizing that the evidence somebody is offering or somebody else's idea contradicts his own idea. And so he recognizes it's different from his own idea and he rejects it. He thinks it's false, okay? So he is engaging. His engagement is superficial. It's not serious engagement. But closed-mindedness doesn't even require superficial engagement. So I think we can be closed-minded by failing to engage in various ways. So we could be closed-minded by ignoring, and I think we need help from philosophers of language here to figure out how all these categories work together. I do not pretend to be able to figure that out. By ignoring rather than dismissing, we could be closed-minded by being oblivious, for instance, to sources. When our being oblivious to sources of knowledge is driven by identity prejudice, we have testimonial injustice. So I think that testimonial injustice is one kind of closed-mindedness. And another way we could be closed-minded by failing to engage with intellectual options is by failing to seek them out, by failing to look outside our echo chambers or our filter bubbles. Yeah. Okay, so the last feature, unwillingness, are on the second page. So Paul refuses to engage. He willfully refuses to engage with alternatives to his belief. But I think willful refusal to engage is required for dogmatism, but not closed-mindedness in general. So we can be closed-minded, but I think by being unable, albeit willing, to engage. So Miranda Fricker has this great example of a card-carrying feminist whose perception, whose motivations and beliefs at the conscious level are all correct, okay? She's got exactly the right motives and beliefs at the conscious level, but her perception's impaired. Okay, she's still, despite wanting to see women as sources of knowledge, struggles to see women as sources of knowledge. Okay, so I think that's a case where we have somebody who's willing to engage but unable, and I think those are cases that still fall under the category of closed-mindedness. I think what this shows us is that our environments can make us closed-minded even when we don't want to be closed-minded. I think there are also cases of indoctrination where somebody might be willing to engage seriously, but might not be able to engage seriously because they've been indoctrinated not to in some way. Okay, I think in cases where somebody's unable to engage, they're not blameworthy for closed-mindedness, at least not in the standard voluntarist sense that requires control. I think they may well be blameworthy in non-voluntarist senses if we can get those going. And I'm going to defer to the folks working in that area. Okay, so key point. The analysis of closed-mindedness I'm using here, it's an unwillingness or inability to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options. Dogmatism is a subset of that. It's an unwillingness to engage seriously with relevant alternatives to a belief we already hold. I want my account to apply not just to false beliefs, the kind of claims I'm using. Paul's belief is presumably false, right? But I think it also applies to true beliefs. So closed-mindedness isn't about content, right? It's about whether we're unwilling or unable to engage seriously with options, all right, whatever the content. Closed-mindedness might be restricted to a particular domain. It might be a general disposition. We can also perform one-off actions that a closed-minded person would perform without having closed-mindedness within a specific domain or without having it generally. So those are the sort of three categories I'm thinking of. Okay, so I'm defining closed-mindedness and dogmatism in terms of relevant intellectual options. I can say more about this in Q&A. I didn't really think, when I was working a lot on virtue, it never really occurred to me that I had to talk about relevance. But now that I'm working on vice, which is more fun, it has occurred to me that I need to use relevance restrictions. So this is a big issue. What are the conditions on relevance here? Okay, I am not going to plump for any one view about this. I am going to try to be open to sort of standard externalist views about relevance and standard internalist views about relevance. For the purposes of this, I'm going to presuppose that we don't have pragmatic or moral encroachment on relevance conditions. So really roughly, externalists are going to say something like relevant or irrelevant options are objectively likely or unlikely to be true. Or, they're going to say slightly more complicated things than that, but that's the basic idea. Internalists are going to say things like options that relevant and irrelevant options are those that the agent has good reason to believe are likely to be true, or doesn't have good reason to believe are likely to be true. So for my point today, it doesn't much matter which of those views we pick, because whichever of those we pick, options like 2 + 3 is 5 and the earth is flat are going to be irrelevant in ordinary environments. Since they're in fact false, we have good reason to believe that they're false. So what this means is that in ordinary environments, we aren't closed-minded in ignoring these options because they aren't even relevant. Okay, so when we ignore them, we don't count as closed-minded. Okay, I want to talk about another possible condition on relevance that's going to come up later, the pervasiveness condition. I think it's a live option, it's a live question as to whether or not we should endorse the pervasiveness condition. So the main idea here is that the widespread presence or absence of an option in an environment suffices to make it relevant or irrelevant. So on the one hand, I think we have reason to think that pervasiveness isn't a good condition on relevance, right? So we have reason to think that the absence of an option in an environment isn't enough to make it irrelevant to our inquiry. If we think about Orwell and the Ministry of Truth, right? The Ministry of Truth is removing options from the environment, right? We see Winston Smith trying to reconstruct his childhood without having any documentation of things that happened in his childhood. So it's destroying facts. Arguably, the facts it destroys are still relevant for agents conducting inquiries in that environment, right? The epistemic environment in 1984 makes its subjects more closed-minded, not less. Right? So it doesn't decrease the number of relevant options by disappearing them. It just makes those options harder to find. Okay. On the other hand, I think we've got some reason to think that pervasiveness might hold as a relevancy condition. We have some reason to think that the ubiquity of an option in an environment makes it relevant. Again, think about 1984. Or an environment that's thoroughly polluted with fake news or alternative facts, right? Arguably, the ubiquitous presence of such options makes them relevant to the agent's inquiry in the same way that the widespread presence of fake barns makes those options relevant. Okay, so that the option that a barn was fake wasn't relevant until you stumbled into fake barn county, right? Where it became relevant and stayed relevant even though your belief is true, right? You end up looking at the one real barn in the county, but still those options are relevant. Okay. Likewise, the option that ignorance is strength wasn't relevant until you wake up in 1984, right? Where it becomes relevant and stays relevant, even though your belief that ignorance is not strength is true. Okay, so in ordinary environments, what I'm suggesting is options like the earth is flat, 2 + 2 is 5, aren't relevant, and we aren't closed-minded in ignoring them. But if pervasiveness as a relevancy condition proves viable, then in hostile environments, options like 2 + 2 is 5 will be relevant, and we will be closed-minded in ignoring them. Okay, so that's some of the background machinery here. Let me say something about intellectual vice. I could talk about this forever. So a few quick things. I'm a pluralist about intellectual vice. I think that generally intellectual vices are qualities that make us bad thinkers. There's more than one way to be a bad thinker and more than one kind of intellectual vice. I think there are 3 kinds. One is effects vices, one is responsibilist vices, one is what I call personalist vices. So roughly, effects vices are the analog of reliabilist virtues. Okay, so effects vices, right? To be an effects vice, a cognitive disposition has to produce a preponderance of bad epistemic effects or prevent us from achieving good epistemic effects. Okay, effects vices technically don't have to be character traits, but for the talk today, it doesn't matter. You can just assume that closed-mindedness is a character trait. Whether it's an effects vice doesn't depend on whether it's a character trait or not. Okay, responsibilist vices are dispositions that do involve bad epistemic character, like intrinsically bad epistemic motives and values for which the agent's blameworthy. And personalist vices involve bad epistemic character, intrinsically bad motives and values for which the agent is not blameworthy in the voluntarist sense. So here I'm thinking about cases of indoctrination, like the Hitler Jugend or ISIS raising little kids to be closed-minded. Okay. So what I'm going to focus on are cases of effects vice. Okay, so in standard cases like Paul's, I think closed-mindedness meets the conditions for an effects vice. It may also simultaneously meet the conditions for a responsibilist vice or a personalist vice, depending on whether Paul's responsible for the character trait. Okay, so Roman numeral 5, closed-mindedness is an effects vice. So here, I'm arguing that closed-mindedness produces a heap of bad epistemic effects for the closed-minded agent herself, for other agents, and for the epistemic environment. Okay, so I'm going to look at each of these categories. So the first category is bad epistemic effects for the closed-minded agent herself. Okay, so I think there are several. The first is sustaining and strengthening false beliefs. Okay, so closed-mindedness enables the person who has it to sustain the false beliefs that she already has. So in Paul's case, closed-mindedness enables him to sustain a false belief. In failing to look for sources outside our own echo chambers, or our epistemic bubbles, we may be sustaining false beliefs that we already have. This came up this morning in Ival's talk. Repeated agreement among our friends in our feeds may even lead us to mistakenly strengthen our confidence in the beliefs that we have. That can be a bad epistemic effect. Axel mentioned this when he was talking about repetition effects. So a second category of bad effects for the closed-minded agent himself, it can prevent the agent from acquiring true beliefs and knowledge, in addition to sustaining and strengthening false beliefs. It can compound and expand an agent's extant system of false beliefs. The agent can, in other words, doxastically double down. So an interesting case of this is a scientific racist named Samuel A. Cartwright, who was a real person. Cartwright was a pre-Civil War medical doctor in the US. He believed that slaves lacked agency. And when he was confronted with evidence to the contrary, specifically slaves' attempts to escape slavery, rather than change his mind and come to believe that slaves did have agency, he doubled down. So he came to believe that slaves had a specific disease that only slaves have, which causes them to try to run. Okay, so rather than revise his beliefs, he doxastically doubled down. Okay. Fourth case, I think that closed-mindedness can produce epistemic opportunity costs, right? So we can, the closed-minded agent, like Samuel Cartwright, can end up pursuing irrelevant projects and inquiries and waste epistemic resources. I think closed-mindedness can produce bad epistemic effects for other agents as well, in addition to the agent, him or herself. It can result in credibility deficit. It can result in systematic and widespread credibility deficit when closed-mindedness takes the form of testimonial injustice. When it takes the form of testimonial injustice, it can impede the development of intellectual virtues and facilitate the development of intellectual vices in women and people of color, whose credibility is being overlooked or denied systematically. It can result in the epistemic exclusion of women and people of color from formal education, and thus result in their in obstructed access to knowledge. It can also result in credibility excess. So if Paul, if in being closed-minded, Paul is just relying on the views of other people in his feed, he may end up allotting the friends in his feed more credibility than they deserve. And this too, Fricker and Medina think, though Fricker thinks this is an essential case of testimonial injustice, but this too, Fricker and Medina think, can lead to the development of intellectual vice in the people who are granted credibility access. And a final point about other agents, it might lead to epistemic corruption. So I think this is particularly important for those of us, as all of us are, teachers, as teachers, as journal editors, if we are on school boards, if we have decision-making power with respect to educational choices in the curriculum and syllabi, which all of us in this room do or will. So I think closed-mindedness in these kinds of cases, when we're making choices about curriculum and choices about which projects get funded and which articles to publish, can create conditions that facilitate closed-mindedness in other people. Ian Kidd has a really nice phrase for this, for the production of epistemic vice in other people. He calls it corruption, epistemic corruption. I think closed-mindedness can also produce bad epistemic effects for the environment. So this is on page 4. We are cruising. It produces epistemic pollution. So closed-minded agents who pursue irrelevant inquiries, like Samuel Cartwright, for instance, and do so sincerely, can unintentionally disseminate falsehoods in their environments. Closed-minded agents who repost the claims of their friends without seeking independent corroboration can populate their feeds with unwitting falsehoods. I think true believers can also intentionally erase competing ideas to prevent other people from believing them, right? We see this in cases of book burnings, for instance. We see this in a recent case where the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, moved all information about anthropogenic climate change off its main website into its archive. So it was harder to access. Closed-mindedness can also obfuscate truths and knowledge. This is another bad effect for the environment. So by inadvertently polluting the environment with false claims, closed-minded agents may be obfuscating truths and making them harder to find. Pollution here, I think, is going to be a matter of degree. So when environments are extremely polluted, that's when I would want to call them hostile. Right? So 1984 is a hostile case. Okay, so does the disposition of closed-mindedness produce a preponderance of bad epistemic effects? In ordinary environments like ours, and there is a footnote there, and I'll come back to that later. In ordinary environments like ours, I think the disposition of closed-mindedness usually meets the conditions of an effects vice. It leads to just a pile of bad epistemic effects. I think it can even meet the conditions for an effects vice when the belief we're being closed-minded about is true. Doesn't have to be a false belief. So if I believe that Trump will not be reelected in 2020, which I do in fact believe, but let's assume, hope that this belief is true, okay? But let's assume my belief is also unjustified. Okay, so let's assume I have a true unjustified belief that Trump will not be reelected in 2020. Perhaps I just arrived at the belief by wishful thinking or something, okay? And suppose I'm closed-minded about that true belief, okay? So in refusing to engage with relevant evidence to the contrary or with sources who disagree with me, I'm ignoring options that are false. Right? So it enables me to sustain the true belief that I have. But in ignoring those options, I'm not engaging with them seriously, and I'm not evaluating them on their merits. So that may enable me to sustain a true belief, but it may block my ability to gain knowledge or understanding. So I think in this case too, when we're closed-minded about true beliefs, this can obstruct the acquisition of knowledge. We're going to see many of the same bad effects just listed, like misplaced confidence if I'm not seeking out alternative sources. So I think that in cases where our beliefs, we're closed-minded about false beliefs or closed-minded about true beliefs, closed-mindedness fails to produce a preponderance of epistemic goods, and that's enough to make it an effects vice in ordinary cases. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Tomas. Okay, fun stuff. Finally, machinery done. Now the fun. Okay, so the last chunk of stuff I want to talk about. So, is closed-mindedness always an intellectual vice? If it's not an intellectual vice, why not? And I'm going to look at two different kinds of questions. The first question is, are there one-off instances of closed-minded action that might produce a preponderance of good epistemic effects? Okay. And the second case is the case of whether the disposition of closed-mindedness would produce a preponderance of good epistemic effects, or at least minimize the bad epistemic effects produced in a hostile epistemic environment. So those are the two cases I'm going to look at. Okay, so first, the one-off instances of closed-minded action. So here, I'm going to consider three different possibilities. I think the jury's still out on the first two possibilities, and I think the third is decisive. So I think the third shows that there are some one-off instances of closed-minded action that produce a preponderance of good epistemic effects. Okay, so the first case is the dogmatism paradox, right? So suppose you're closed-minded with respect to knowledge that you already possess, okay? The dogmatism paradox comes part from Kripke. I've got a nice quote from Ernie Souza here that describes it. So Souza says, quote, "Once you know that P, you can deduce that any evidence contrary to P would be misleading. Whereas positive evidence would probably do you little good. After all, by hypothesis, you already know the P. Given this, you should close your mind to any new potential evidence to the question whether P. If positive, the evidence will do little for you. If negative, it will harmfully pull you away from the truth and may even cost you the knowledge that you have." So the question here is, does closed-mindedness enable the agent to sustain her knowledge when she's being closed-minded with respect to something she knows? Okay? I think the jury's still out here, and I'm going to let the people who are working in that area fight it out. Okay, so Kasim Kassam argues that when you're closed-minded with respect to something you know, you lose the knowledge. Okay? Jeremy Fantle, in direct contradiction to that, argues that there are cases where you can be closed-minded with respect to something you know and retain your knowledge. And Ernie Souza wants to say two things about this. He wants to say you lose your reflective knowledge, right? Or what he would say today is you don't know full well, right? But you retain your animal knowledge. Okay, so I think the jury's still out on this. I think this is a potential area where we may get a positive solution which says, yes, this could be a case where being closed-minded, one-off instances of closed-minded action are going to produce a preponderance of epistemic goods. Okay, but I think the jury's still out. The second kind of case, so we're on page 5. And these are also fascinating cases. So cases where you've got a closed-minded agent, one or more closed-minded agents in a group of people. And the question is whether the actions of the closed-minded agent in that group will produce a preponderance of good epistemic effects for the group as a whole. There's several folks who are quite optimistic about this. So Adam Morton is optimistic about this. He's actually optimistic about the case where you can have an entire group of individually closed-minded agents whose closed-minded actions will produce a preponderance of good epistemic effects for the group as a whole. Miranda Fricker is optimistic about this. Chris Hookway is optimistic. So again, I think this is an area, we just need more work in this area. And again, this could end up being a case where we want to say there are instances of closed-minded action that produce good effects overall. Okay, here's the decisive case. And I want to give a shout out to Amy because she helped me think about this last summer, actually. So think about the most recent article you wrote, or about what it took to actually start writing your dissertation. Those of you who are doing that, thank you. At some point, you likely ignored relevant options in order to focus on developing your own answer. Not because it was your own, but because it was the answer, right? Or at least you thought that. You thought it was true, right? You stopped reading alternative views. You tuned them out. You knew that another article had just been published on your topic, but you ignored it in an effort to make progress on the solution you thought was correct. So according to my analysis of closed-mindedness, this behavior counts as closed-minded. Okay, those one-off actions that fit that description count as closed-minded. Now, I think there will be some cases, not all, okay, but some cases where this kind of action produces a preponderance of good epistemic effects. I have in mind here a friend of mine who actually does HIV research for the National Institutes of Health in the US, though what I'm about to say does not I'm using philosophical liberty here. So imagine researchers who are on the verge of a big discovery and who ignore relevant but different work that has just been published in order to push forward and successfully complete their own line of inquiry. They may even causally need to ignore that work in order to make their discovery. I think here the goods produced are epistemic. They get knowledge, they make the discovery, the method's epistemic, they push forward in their own inquiry, their motives are epistemic, they're motivated to attain knowledge. So the values in play are epistemic, and they're not merely moral or pragmatic values. I think there's some cases of ignoring relevant options that will produce a preponderance of merely pragmatic or moral goods, but not epistemic ones. So we can imagine a case where and probably many of us have had this kind of situation or done this ourselves. Imagine a graduating senior, right, about to graduate from college, right? They are writing their very last paper in college. It's for your class, okay? And this example is thanks to Amy. They use 2 sources in their research paper, right? They close off their inquiry so that they can turn the paper in on time, get a minimally passing grade, and graduate. Okay? So shutting off their inquiry produces a pragmatic good. Presumably it gets them, they get, actually using the 2 sources, the open-minded bit of that gets them a decent enough grade to pass. Closing off the inquiry produces the pragmatic good of turning the paper in and graduating on time, etc. But closing off the inquiry itself isn't producing epistemic goods, right? They would achieve better or further epistemic goods. They would write a better paper if they kept their inquiry open. Okay, so they're not like the researchers at the National Institutes of Health. I think there are tougher cases where we close off inquiry after gaining just enough knowledge. So, and they're tough case where it's tough to figure out whether closing off the inquiry produces epistemic goods or not. So imagine I've promised my best friend that I'll bring a pavlova to her party tomorrow. Do y'all know what pavlova is? Just like a meringue thing, right? It's an eggy meringue. It's Australian. Yeah. Okay. So suppose I promise my best friend I'm going to bring a pavlova to her party tomorrow. I have never made one before. Okay, so what do? I Google it. Okay, Google, returns 10 million recipes or whatever. Okay, so suppose I look at 20 by celebrity bakers. Okay, And I close off my inquiry after 20. Okay, I produce a serviceable pavlova that doesn't poison anyone, and I get it to the party on time. Okay, so my closing off my inquiry produces a moral good. I actually keep my promise. It produces a pragmatic good. Does it produce epistemic goods? This is a tough case, I think. So on the one hand, maybe it doesn't, because it could be that like the 25th recipe would get me like that true insight into baking meringue that I don't have. Okay, I might get further or better epistemic goods if I got up to 25. But it could be that at 20 recipes, which to me seems like a ridiculous number of recipes, like I have just hit the point of diminishing epistemic returns. Right? Okay. Finally, I just want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about the disposition of closed-mindedness as an effects virtue in hostile environments. So here, I'm thinking about closed-mindedness as a burden virtue of sorts, sort of along the lines that Lisa Tessman is talking about burden virtues. So she's thinking about burden virtues as qualities that enable us to survive in oppressive or hostile environments. And there's more to her definition that I may not necessarily be taken on. Okay, so basic setup here. Assume for the sake of argument that the pervasiveness condition on relevancy holds. Okay, assume that ends up being viable. Okay, the widespread presence of an option in an environment suffices to make it relevant. Suppose that an epistemically hostile environment isn't minimally polluted or moderately polluted, it's extremely polluted. It's saturated with options that are false or unreliable. Some of these options are going to be misinformation, explicit statements like 2 + 2 is 5. Some of them are going to be unreliable sources, like the dimwits or the idiots in Mike Judge's film, The Idiocracy. Have you all seen that film? Okay. Some are going to be implicit norms that discredit women and people of color as sources of knowledge. The pervasiveness condition renders all of these options relevant. Okay. Question here, what is a knowledge-possessing agent to do when she wakes up in an epistemically hostile environment? My proposal is that epistemically she has reasons to be closed-minded. Okay, so I think epistemically she should be unwilling to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options that conflict with what she already knows. So why? Why should she be closed-minded? Because in an epistemically hostile environment, I think closed-mindedness is an effects virtue. When a knowledge-possessing agent is stuck in a hostile environment, surrounded by falsehoods, the dimwits of the idiocracy, right, judges and competent sources, and diversions and distractions, closed-mindedness about options that conflict with what she knows will minimize the production of bad epistemic effects for her. They enable her to survive in the environment. So a couple things about effects for her, and then I'll talk really quickly about effects on the other agents and the environment itself. Effects for her, it enables her to sustain her true beliefs. Now, in ordinary environments, that may be relatively trivial. In 1984, not trivial at all. Okay, so 1984, you've got 2 + 2 is 5 blaring out of every open screen. Right? So risk of changing belief is very high. So being able to sustain a true belief is a good, an epistemic good. Closed-mindedness in that environment prevents her from devoting resources to options that are relevant but misguided and from amassing opportunity costs. She avoids that bad. And it frees her up, right, to pursue her own projects. Okay, I think that's a second good. There are some agents, members of non-dominant groups, members of marginalized groups, who do not have to imagine being in a hostile environment because they're already in one. Okay, so I think closed-mindedness might be an especially important resource for members of non-dominant groups. Okay, and it can enable agents to hold on to their true beliefs. There's a great question about knowledge. And then finally, I'll just say one quick thing about other agents. So you might think that in an epistemically hostile environment like the Idiocracy or 1984, that the knowledge-possessing agent should engage with other agents, not because the knowledge-possessing agent, is open to revising her belief that 2 + 2 is 4, but because she wants to help change the minds of the other agents who are deluded, right? But I think that in a hostile environment, the likelihood of success in changing the minds of the other agents is low through one-on-one engagement. And one can actually do more harm than good. One can end up granting them credibility excess, which can produce further epistemic harms. And one can also potentially harm the epistemic environment by engaging with the Ministry of Truth. Like, it's really hard to avoid being manipulated by the Ministry of Truth, which is tonalizing. One final thing, and I want to read this one point, and then I will shut up and not say anything ever again, just because it's really important given what David and Regina and Karen have been talking about. So I've been thinking, our ordinary environment, it's not as great as it used to be, but it's not that bad. Okay, and then listening to Karen and Regina, I thought, maybe it's a lot worse than I thought, right? Because, we got, deep things that have been debunked that are still up on our Google searches. We got deep fakes. Oh, I should be worried. Okay, and then I heard David this morning and thought, well, I don't know, should I be worried? Okay, so I just want to read this bit. So I advise caution in any attempts to apply claims about hostile environments to our current environment. Our current environment is not hostile for members of dominant groups, as I'm using that term. It may be moderately polluted, and I certainly think it is. It's at least moderately polluted, and Karen and Regina are making me think, how is it more than that? And David's encouraging me to pull back. Okay, so it may be moderately polluted, but it isn't extremely polluted. It isn't utterly saturated with false and unreliable options in the way that 1984 and the Idiocracy are. This has 2 repercussions. First, the second repercussion, even if some misguided options, like Donald Trump as a good president, are pervasive enough in our current environment to count as relevant, and even if we're closed-minded in ignoring them, our closed-mindedness might produce different epistemic effects in our current environment than it would in the 1984 case. Okay? We need to ask whether in our environment, closed-mindedness on the part of the knowledge-possessing agent will minimize bad effects for other people. It may not. A proportion of Trump voters can be convinced otherwise. Engaging with them may produce a preponderance of good epistemic effects for them. Likewise, we need to ask whether closed-mindedness on the part of knowledge-possessing agents will minimize bad epistemic effects for the environment we're currently in. Being closed-minded may, in our current environment, be corrupting. It may actually encourage other people to be closed-minded too. Okay, and I will stop there.